today's or this morning's program from the German American Institute. We're proud to host another program that we're collaboratively putting together with SpringerNature, famous science publishing company. This joint program with partner SpringerNature, who is one of the leading global publishers for academic books, with over 13,000 new books a year, 3,000 journals, among them Nature and Scientific American, as well as Leitende Redakteurin. It's the second edition. We've had one last year. And again, we're at the on the edge, on the first forefront of the International Science Festival, Geist Heidelberg here in Heidelberg at the DAI. Welcome to the stream. Welcome everyone. We have two guests tonight. Changed a little our schedule to two guests tonight, and we've two really interesting topics on information in the broadest sense. Why information is important, and why misinformation is dangerous, and why it is very dangerous if there's no or wrong or lacking information. Research and learning are essential for a society to grow and for science to proceed and for scientific advances and scientists and authors to be successful in society. So we're also looking at how society and science, how scientific advances have an impact on society. With SpringerNature, our partner, we have this very same ideal. We have this very same vision of making science and scientific approaches and methods and proceedings accessible and democratically experienceable, I want to say. Before we start, there's some rules to the chat. You can ask your questions to whatever area of interest you want to adapt during the talks, and we'll discuss them after the keynote speeches. You can also send in emails. Just simply write to info@dai-heidelberg.de. All this information is also below the video. You can just access it. For those generally interested, please follow us on Twitter and all social media channels, and write to us and be, I don't know, creative with everything you want to say, and let go constructive criticisms, and everything's welcome. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow our guests on Twitter, and follow our cooperation partner tonight in the program, SpringerNature. My name is Johannes Alisch. I'm proud and happy to be your host tonight at the DAI in Heidelberg, and I'm glad to welcome our first guest in the meeting and in the stream for tonight in the next 45 minutes, including our discussion, Jen Schwartz. She's senior features editor at Scientific American, one of those journals that SpringerNature is publishing. She produces stories about how societies are adapting to a changing world. She is known for her work on trauma of healthcare workers during the pandemic, known for her work on the anguish of uncertainty, which is a major issue, a major theme Scientific American is focusing on these days. She's famous for her work on disinformation, and won the National Association of Science Writers Science and Society Award in 2019. On her work in Truth, Lies, and Uncertainty, a publication in 2019, a special issue of the journal she's working for. She is very close to what she's going to talk about today. Welcome. Misinformation, how to recognize and go about it, how to combat misinformation. Welcome, the stage is all yours, Jen Schwartz.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, this topic has been very close to me and at times quite overwhelming over the past few years as we try to grapple with it. So I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking with you all. So I wanted to quickly just talk a little bit more about what I do. Scientific American, we are part of the SpringerNature family. And unlike a lot of, many research journals, we are a consumer-facing magazine. So I am a journalist and an editor of journalism. I also edit experts and researchers, but my approach is definitely journalistic, and that is what Scientific American does. So we are not, we don't publish peer-reviewed work, but we sort of look to a lot of that work and then ask either the experts who are working on it or journalists to write about what the implications might be, or to explain it to a lay audience. And I'm often quite curious about, what does this mean for society? What does this mean for me personally? What does this mean to so many of the issues that might go beyond that particular niche or that particular field of science? And so misinformation encompasses so many of these things. It is not just one field. And I would say over the past several years, it has truly been a part of so many fields of research. And there is more and more funding and interest and need to understand more deeply how our information ecosystems have become so dysfunctional. And the pandemic has, in many cases, been a magnifying glass for so many of the fragilities that already existed. And it has perpetuated, existing ones and shown us new ways in that we are vulnerable to understanding something that is so emergent, something that includes so much uncertainty, and something that really requires both rigorous science and rigorous public health communication, cooperation across the globe, and a sense of institutional trust, and frankly, just cooperation among, all people. And we are seeing all of the ways that we are vulnerable, and how many of these things have been falling apart, and how we need to strengthen them. So that is where I come from. I do not have a PhD. I am a journalist, and I don't follow each new report as it comes out. I tend to, assign and write myself big picture stories to help us get our heads around how to make sense of this world. So, there's been a few projects that I've worked on. One was, as mentioned, in 2019, Scientific American put out an entire issue called Truth, Lies, and Uncertainty. And we were trying to grapple with how to make sense of reality in a world that can feel so unreal, when we've sort of lost our sense of what is truth and what is fact, and what is a lie versus what is an obfuscation. What, propaganda has been around forever, and yet social media makes things quite new. So making sense of so many of the ways technology is changing how we communicate knowledge, but also honoring the long history of manipulation, corruption, propaganda, and the different ways in which power has been, sought after through using information and manipulating it. So, we looked at, is math invented or is it discovered? Do we, from a neuroscience perspective, do we all perceive reality differently? Humans are not the only animals that have deception as part of how they operate and survive. We looked at, network science and the philosophy of science, and to try to get an understanding of different spread of information, and how nodes of a propagandist or an information agent can really change perceptions of various groups. But what I really want to talk about today is where we all stand even right now. And admittedly, my bias is I'm based in the US, I'm based in New York. And I will say there are things about the US that I know that not everyone else experiences, in terms of how we make sense, especially of scientific information, and especially how we have been dealing with the pandemic. But of course, there's lots of things that we all share, and lots of problems that we all share. So I think, at least in my world, there's a lot of feelings of overwhelm, of how do we deal with the fact that certain people are just so resistant to getting the vaccine? How do we communicate the science? How is it that some people just, we have some people in the US who really want their booster shots and others who won't get the vaccine in the first place. And it can be difficult as communicators of knowledge to try to reach all types of groups. But so often we are in a world today where it is a binary and things are forced into a black and white concept. So I'm really interested when it comes to misinformation. How do we erase, truth versus lies and look at it as a spectrum of how information is communicated and how it is manipulated? I just want to, start with, there's going to be just 3 parts here. How we identify misinformation in its many forms, how we are all vulnerable to it, what makes us vulnerable to disbelief. We'll touch a little bit on conspiracy theories and a little bit on, various actors in the space, and understand that it's not just about catching and hunting for deliberate disinformation, but of understanding how it percolates through media ecosystems and how all of us are part of that, even though we may not realize it. And I want to finish by talking about, of course, what to do about it. And as I'll talk about it from a journalism perspective, the way that researchers are dealing with it, but I think most importantly, how all of us can better sort of grapple with it. I had done a special report in November of 2020. Is that the right? Yes, during right before the presidential elections in the U.S. of just how we can start to feel more calm about the information space that we're in. I think globally there is so much exhaustion and confusion about how to make sense of the pandemic. And then, of course, right along with that, climate change and all of these ways that our world is rapidly changing. So with that, let's talk about how to identify and understand misinformation. So there is, of course, a lot, we often focus on social media a lot of times when we look at the modern types of misinformation, and that is a very big part of it. And it is new and it is being studied in really rigorous ways. So many of us operate online, and social platforms are where most people get most of their news. Although I would say it's where people get most of their information. And we are not often all, seeking out a single source, going to typing in NewYorkTimes.com. But when we all encounter how information through our feeds, it changes our perception of the world. And so in 2019, one researcher that I'm very fond of, Claire Wardle, she has an organization called First Draft. And they help people make sense of misinformation. And they help journalists try to figure out how to both report on misinformation and how not to perpetuate misinformation as they're going about their own work. And Claire Wardle wrote for us a feature called A New World Disorder. And it was really important in how it discussed how social media has perpetuated long-standing issues with how humanity grapples with uncertainty, such as influence operations, but also to show how social media doesn't just exist online. To be smart consumers today, we need to understand that what we interact with online is also part of a larger media ecosystem. And in the US, a lot of the disinformation has often started from the very top of our government and from far right and conservative news stations. And this is not just some political statement. It has been rigorously studied. And so we're seeing how it is not just a matter of people feeling overwhelmed and confused, or perhaps a Russian troll farm, pretending to be users on Twitter who they are not. But it really comes from so many different levels: people who are in power, people who feel disempowered, people who just want to stir up chaos, and that can make you feel very powerful. And so that piece, I highly recommend reading it as a primer for what misinformation and disinformation looks like and how it's being studied today. I think it's important to point out that this is a rapidly changing field. And whereas it used to feel very fringe and affect only certain corners of the internet, perhaps, it is now part of everything that we grapple with today. So I want to go back to this special report that we put together and look at how behavioral sciences are also informing how we make sense of our world. So uncertainty is something that humans are very bad at dealing with. We hate when we don't have a clear answer to something. And so it is not just something we can look at and say social media is ruining reality. It is in part because its business model is based on sort of exploiting that uncertainty and our fear and outrage. But we have to understand what makes us susceptible to that in the first place. So behavioral sciences have been looking into for a long time why uncertainty makes us so uncomfortable and how it often drives leaders who can exploit that uncertainty to put us into this mindset of us versus them. So when we don't have clear answers to things, as in an emerging pandemic, often we look for charismatic leaders who will tell us with certainty why something is wrong or what we need to do to make things better. But they do that by blaming an outgroup. And that goes back a long while in behavioral sciences. We've known this for a long time. But it's been especially meaningful in understanding why today there's so much polarization and so much antagonism, and how that makes it even more difficult to work together to try to understand where, if not the truth is, how we can take the best evidence-based approaches to make sense of our changing world. So the behavioral sciences are also a really important place to look at why we are so susceptible to misinformation and why we are so susceptible to disinformation, which is, by the way, different in that is intentionally wrong. It is intended to deceive. It is put out to create either chaos or confusion, whereas misinformation is sort of in an umbrella category where it's just information that is wrong. And on Facebook, someone might post something that is misinformation, but they are not doing it to intentionally deceive. They're doing it because that's what they believe. And so there is, a difference when we talk about these things. So many people are not evil and trying to confuse others or trying to hurt others, but they are trapped in this disordered information landscape. Disinformation is when it is intentional and it is meant to hurt and do damage and deceive, or it is meant to damage a reputation or to make people doubt in the veracity of institutions or leaders or whomever else is in power. So that's a very important distinction as well. So now that we've discussed these things, I want to move on to the rise of institutional distrust. So this is also what makes us so vulnerable. I think there's been so many studies that have come out over the past several years looking at distrust in science and distrust in institutions in general. In the US, this is a huge problem. And I think when we have an emerging crisis that is still changing, of course, such as the pandemic, it is exploited to say, hey, this institution, we can't trust them. And once you have that problem, it is harder and harder to get everybody on board to a shared goal. So that is another area of research, political science and the social sciences, that is really important for understanding why we are in this mess. We just had a writer write for us on the anniversary of 9/11 about why 9/11 was a turning point in terms of misinformation and conspiratorial thinking. And it's not because social media was around back then, but because there were a level of propaganda from the government to its citizens, and the media not doing a good enough job to push back against that really hurt a lot of trust in the US. And that created some of the conditions that allowed, when social media came online, it sort of fed the conditions that make us distrustful, and then makes it easier for other actors to exploit that distrust. So those are just some areas of science that I have been following that are investing more time and resources into showing that misinformation is not just a social media problem. It really touches all aspects of our society. So I want to turn to what we can do about this. So journalistically, journalists all over the world have had to adjust in some ways how they report on any topic, but particularly I'm going to focus on the pandemic and the public health crisis. We are working with something that is rapidly changing. And of course, what might be the best knowledge that we have today might not be entirely accurate a month from now or 6 months from now. Now, that doesn't mean that what we are working off of today is wrong, or it doesn't come from a good place. But we have to help the public understand as journalists that we can only make the best choices today based on the scientific evidence and analysis that we have, and that this is an emerging and changing situation. So I think a lot of journalists have started to really think about, how do we do more hand-holding in how we write about facts and truth and evidence to help people make the best decisions that they can, while also leaving open that we are going to be learning more things in the future, and that it doesn't mean that we were wrong, or that we were putting out propaganda before, but that as we learn more, we get closer and closer to making better decisions for society. And I think that process has often happened behind closed doors, both in the scientific research, and as journalists, you're often reporting, and how do we just make clarity in what we're communicating? Same with science. How do we just write papers that communicate our findings? But I think what we're seeing more and more today is the importance of context and the importance of communicating with an eye toward public understanding. That's always been important, but misinformation makes it especially so, because we have to anticipate how holes and gaps in our communication can be exploited to make people distrust our findings and not trust the institutions that are doing the best practices of getting to the bottom of things and explaining their findings. So I think that's important for everyone, but journalists and researchers, I think, are having an eye toward not just asking, how do I explain what's important, but how do I explain it in a way that I am taking into account if someone is very skeptical of an institution or skeptical of a way that something's been done. How do I account for that in my phrasing? This is not a manipulation. It is truly getting used to operating in a fast-moving world where you have to meet people where they are. And so that has changed, I think, not just how people write in their papers, but also has helped research directions as well. This is a question that's being asked at the outset rather as an afterthought. And I think that's really important. I also want to talk about the power of understanding the consequences of misinformation. So all of us are, I think I wrote something once that all of us are nodes on the battlefield of information warfare today. If you operate online, if you are on any social platform, every time you like something or share something or comment, you are perpetuating a system of this business model where there's certain information gets amplified. So think of it this way. If you are being targeted because of outrage, because of fear, because something really aligns with your identity, I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that we have a chance to pause and say, am I sharing this because this aligns with my identity? And if I were somebody who I completely disagreed with, they would be sharing something that aligns with their identity and feel just as strongly about it. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't share information that we care about, that we shouldn't spread knowledge that we know to be important. But I think all of us are susceptible. And when we stop looking at it in terms of who is right versus who is wrong, we see how we are all part of a system that rewards outrage, fear, excitability, impassioned statements. And so something that I have done as a journalist is participate in role play simulations. And a lot of organizations, public health organizations, private companies, and increasingly newsrooms are actually doing simulations of what could go wrong with misinformation. So if you put out a story and then it goes out of control on social media, what might happen? How do you respond to that? And so I think that for me personally, I can report on misinformation, I can work with experts in the space, but it's not until I can role play what it's like to be part of a high stakes moment, whether it's an election or something going on with COVID, where you realize how powerful misinformation can be. And I think all of us should put ourselves in that space whenever we can, and to pause and say, am I perpetuating, even if this is true, am I perpetuating a system that rewards and amplifies the most impassioned information? And instead, should I just read this thing that interests me, and instead of just sharing it and liking it without first understanding it and digesting what it means? I think for me, that has been the most helpful way to make sense of an overwhelming information ecosystem. And I think that is the way that all of us can do better in terms of being stewards of a healthier internet. And I think that that same attitude helps us out in the real world, where we're not online and we're encountering people who might have different opinions and might be sharing things that you might recognize as misinformation. And instead of talking to them by saying you're wrong, here are the facts, which is just going to create more antagonism, having an open mind to what they might have been exposed to, how they are susceptible to misinformation, how they are being targeted algorithmically with things that will feed their own biases. And I think if we take this more empathetic approach, it doesn't mean letting things go. It doesn't mean letting misinformation just perpetuate wildly, but having a stance of curiosity, both for your own understanding of how you're getting information and giving others the benefit of the doubt that they might be really confused and overwhelmed as well. So a lot of my work going forward is examining that. How do we do a better job of accepting that this is the information ecosystem we live in, and that we all need to get better at grappling with uncertainty, confusion, feelings of outrage and helplessness. And instead of being part of this intense, impassioned information overload where we look for blame and we look for easy answers, how can we be a little bit more comfortable in the messiness of uncertainty and see others who are struggling with that and help each other have a better sense of how to make sense of an uncertain time? So I think that is where we have the most work to do, and where the humanities, the social sciences are doing a ton of excellent research of helping us get there. And of course, from the technological angle, how do our social platforms need to be better in terms of not perpetuating these harmful ways of sharing knowledge? So with that, I want to open it up to questions, and happy to discuss things broadly about misinformation or disinformation.
Thank you very much, Jen, for sharing your insights and sharing sort of sort of coming from all those words that add up to information here and disinformation, misinformation there, and really clearly integrating differentiation here. I have a very quick, simple question to start with. Do you believe that if the medium is the message, anything, I mean, in this very broad idea, anything, any bit of knowledge, any finding, any truth, any fact could be conveyed to maybe anyone if the medium is right?
I think that in terms of media, which is a very broad area, by the way, media gets lumped as a single entity, but it's an incredibly diverse industry. When it comes to journalism and any type of newsroom where you're doing rigorous journalistic work and how you approach conveying information to the public, I think it is way too difficult to anticipate, to get out ahead of every piece of misinformation that can be out there. There's a saying that everyone here has probably heard, a lie has gone around the world before the truth gets out of bed. And what's important there is to recognize that we will always be playing a game of cat and mouse if we try to respond to misinformation as it crops up. So it's really important as journalists or any news entity to really, instead of just reporting on what they see or being reactionary, to ask ourselves questions all the time of what might be emerging, what are some of the top questions that the public might have, what concerns do they have, what misinformation is already percolating that could be, that we need to answer, that we need to anticipate. And so I think there's a much bigger environment of anticipation of how misinformation is going to cloud evidence-based journalism and evidence-based science. Not to wait until it's already a problem, but to really ask, what does the public most need to know, and how are they going to be, how are they already going to be coming to us with what biases or fears or what is already circulating on YouTube, for instance. So I think instead of being reactionary all the time, there is a much greater push to be proactive in thinking not just about what does the public need to know, but what are the misinformation narratives that we need to anticipate in our own work.
And what would be a medium to convey one or the other fact, maybe, or narrative? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's the mediums that exist already, in terms of, whether it's a digital print story or a video or on Twitter, on social media, or, what the mediums that exist, I don't think it's so much an issue of medium, because you can do all of this work in any medium. Certainly so much of the disinformation and confusion exists in more spaces than others. But I think it's wrong to say that, maybe like several years ago, we would say, oh, it's just on, Facebook, or it's a YouTube problem, and, it's a troll farm somewhere. But the reality is that misinformation exists at every level of the media, from traditional to new. And so doing that work of rigorous journalism needs to exist at every level. But I will say that because so much of how we glean knowledge and communicate is now happening in spaces such as closed messaging apps, which are harder for researchers and journalists to examine, of how narratives and stories and all sorts of things are rising and being communicated we can't be everywhere and we at once, and we also don't have access to all of these spaces. So it is becoming harder and harder to track emerging narratives. And one of the blind spots for both journalism and civil society groups is we can't research what we cannot see and what we don't have access to. So that is certainly a problem that a lot of groups are working on, but there's constant issues of access.
So missing information is probably that's a problem of institutions as well, because I like this idea, this notion of giving yourself a chance to pause at times and reflect on a tweet or whatever is circulating and pops up in front of your face on a screen. And all this sort of notion of the negative emotional sort of environment and aura, it sort of may convey or may trigger this immediate response that is sort of unhealthy in potentiality, right? So my question would be, where would you see responsibility in institutions such as, I don't know, social media platforms, firms, information companies, and so on, as opposed to the very personal sort of responsibility for would I share this or not without reflecting?
So I think there's two things going on here. There are private companies, like Facebook and Twitter, and there are government institutions and just democratic institutions where trust has been in decline. And so there's of course a lot of pressure on private companies to assess how their very business models perpetuate a lot of these problems. And that is, really in many cases a regulation and a policy issue. In terms of say public health institutions, I think what we've seen is a real need to not just dictate things top down, not put out a single message, but the need to understand that groups have very different, people have very different types of hesitancies toward receiving and trusting information. And if you are just saying, we are an institution, trust us, or not, you're missing so many rational reasons why people might have distrust. And I think we've seen a lot of, at least in the US, because that's what I've been tracking, we've seen a lot of acknowledgement that you need to cater your messaging toward different groups. And it's not in an infantilizing way, but because certain groups might have serious reasons why they might not trust medical institutions. I think where we've made a lot of progress is showing that institutions are not infallible. And by understanding that they need to communicate with local leaders and understand that trust is not just about giving one message and hoping it percolates, but of really reaching people where they are and working on their messaging, not to condescend or not to try to get around or ignore legitimate reasons for perhaps distrust or skepticism, but to confront those things head on. And I think that's what we've been seeing more of, at least over the past couple of years, is that if we really want to address a crisis like the pandemic, like vaccines, or like anything, mask wearing, you need to not just group all people who are hesitant about a vaccine into one group. You will never reach them that way. And so I think that this more detailed level of messaging and of community outreach and of understanding the importance of networks of leadership, of saying, perhaps a church leader is the best person to be communicating to his or her community, not just a memo from the CDC. So I think there's a huge amount of responsibility for our big institutions to recognize where that a lot of people are not anti their message, but they need to be communicated to in a different way. And that communication needs to be much more open and much more of a dialogue, and treat people with curiosity rather than just flatly dismissing them and telling them that they're wrong.
Curiosity is a nice nice word to come to the next question. It's from the chat, and I don't know if it's sort of in your field of focus. It's about cryptography, and here's the question. What I'm curious about is how would cryptographic signing of messages avoid anonymity? And do you think it would reduce trolling or false information? And there's something else, global web of trust. He or she writes, like, who can have one pseudonym, but you cannot be anonymous anymore?
So that is an example of one facet of how we're trying to fix some of the problems of social media. And what I think this person is referring to in some regard is we have a black box problem in a lot of ways or the public does, and many researchers of, if someone is posting on Twitter, how do we know it's really that person? We know that a huge problem online is, whether it's called sock puppets or any number of terminology of someone pretending to be someone else to infiltrate a certain and very specific type of population, to plant narratives and ideas, or to perpetuate ones that are already there and create more divisiveness, more anger, and having a signature, having identity be validated is one facet of how we could help mitigate that problem. There are dozens of solutions like this. A lot of them would certainly help. Some of them run into other issues. Being anonymous online can also be very helpful for certain people. There are reasons in which not being anonymous is bad for other groups, especially vulnerable groups online. And so there's a lot of nuance to all of these discussions, but certainly part of the problem right now is that not just the public, but many researchers who are researching disinformation don't have access to where these accounts are coming from. And it's still easy enough to be able to have a fake account. So that is certainly one way to address the problem. And that is a specific technological change that is important. What I've been talking about is more like the broader ways that we communicate and information, but that is a perfect example of one way that technology companies and frankly that regulation could be looking into how to address this problem.
Yeah, that's a tricky situation, being anonymous or pseudonymous and having a right to not be known and not be recognizable in a certain way. I mean, there could be no better keyword or no better idea than this, than anonymity and pseudonymity, and maybe being known for what you do and maybe unrecognized or recognizable. To lead over to our next speaker, Cobus de Swardt. Jen Schwartz, many thanks. Cordial thanks to New York. You have probably escaped a bit of a city hassle and big city hassle and leading a calmer life just outside of New York. We've learned in the beginning. We've had wonderful insights into your work, into your stance, and I think it's more of an attitude that you try to sort of convey, and I think it really did touch upon all those important aspects of mis and disinformation and how we go about information. Thank you very much. Anybody who is still keen on asking more questions to Jen Schwartz, you can still post your questions into the chat, and we might get back to you later. Now, welcome Cobus de Swardt, our second speaker in tonight's program. Cobus de Swardt has served Transparency International for 10 years. He's been its global managing director, and today he's no longer part of Transparency International. Today, his book on whistleblowers and the destiny of whistleblowers is coming out. It's coming out at SpringerNature. He has worked on 4 continents as an academic and seeks to combine professional expertise with social activism throughout his career. He developed a deep belief in social justice and moral integrity, which is also one of the motivations for his book, Silencing a Whistleblower. He's going to talk about a case study, the case study of Transparency International that he's witnessed close enough himself. Welcome. We're keen on your insights and keen on the little, I mean, it's a festive event, I shall say, because the book is coming out today, and he joins us from Berlin, and we're excited to have him on the show.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you for joining this presentation of my book, Silencing a Whistleblower, A Story of Hypocrisy. In my presentation, I will talk about how I became an activist, including some of my experiences in apartheid South Africa and as a whistleblower in Transparency International, in short also TI, over the years. I will also talk how an ethical breakdown could have happened in Transparency International, and lastly, very briefly, what is for me the most important lesson from the book. I was most definitely not born or brought up to be an activist. On the contrary, from early childhood, all I wanted to be was an academic. Well, that's until I left my dreams of becoming a firefighter after seeing a fire on Table Mountain as a 5-year-old. For me, our bookshelf was like a candy shop. To discover new things in books was an adventure like no other. And it kind of catapulted me out of my white Afrikaner enclave that was also driven by Calvinistic values in the Cape Town of the 1960s into new exciting worlds. Books was my greatest inspiration. But this bliss ended rather abruptly in the early 70s when I had real escapes out of my white enclave. I was now confronted with South Africa, racism and inequality. At first, I simply thought it was unfair that Black kids I played with on my grandfather's farm were treated very differently. And why could they not join our evening Bible reading? More and more, I experience a disconnect between the Calvinistic values I was brought up on, fairness, respect, truth, and the actions from those who taught me those values. As a teenager, I confronted this. In doing so, I experienced the virulence of those in power when you confront them with the discrepancy between the values they preach and the actions they do. For example, I used teachings from the Bible to argue against Blacks being banned from my church. The priest ended the argument and threw me out of church. For a 12-year-old, a humiliating experience. Be that as it may, I came to appreciate that I could not be free if my freedom was built on injustice and the exploitation of others. I became an activist by default. Whilst I would not want to go back to those days, the pain of being shunned by my family and friends still hurts. I have no regrets for the rough times of security police interrogations or spent in prison. If you don't follow your conscience, I believe it will haunt you. After the end of apartheid, I did indeed work as an academic for many years. But somehow the human rights activist genes were now inside me. More and more, I saw the universal injustices caused by corruption, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. When I met Peter Eigen, the founder of Transparency International, I was inspired by him and by TI's core values of transparency, accountability, and integrity. I felt privileged to join TI, and even more so to be its managing director for 10 years. TI is widely seen as a world leader on anti-corruption and whistleblower protection. Unfortunately, with the TI board elected at the end of 2014, the organization experienced an ethical breakdown. For 2 years, I sought in vain to address the abuse of power, conflict of interest, and organizational capture with my superiors in the board. I submitted my first whistleblower complaint on unethical conduct to TI in March 2017. Since then, 11 more whistleblower complaints followed, including on TI's whistleblower retaliations. In the light of unaddressed wrongdoing, I also submitted a whistleblower complaint to TI's donors and reported it to TI's NGO peers and made 2 detailed submissions to so-called independent investigations. In contrast to its policies, TI treated the whistleblower allegations against its leadership as a dispute between the organization and the whistleblower, a case to be settled. Instead of investigating the content in accordance with its policies and principles, it used tactical means and loopholes in German whistleblower protection laws to shoot the messenger. For the last decade, TI has led global campaigns against those very tactics and such legal loopholes. Throughout its history, TI has called out the abuse of entrusted power for private gain as corruption and fought against it with all its might. Yet it turned a blind eye to its own leadership, systematically doing exactly that over several years. One rightly should ask the question, how could this have happened in TI? TI's whistleblower policy and principles became obsolete as they were not embedded in robust ethical systems. TI's ethical systems lacked rigorous checks and balances, truly independent oversight, appeal, investigation, and scrutiny mechanisms, as well as comprehensive public transparency and accountability on performance. Moreover, when tasked to deal with TI's ethical problems, 36 donors and peers of TI, including major governments, foundations, and NGOs, did not hold TI to account. Instead, they looked the other way. Over time, they too became instrumental in TI's cover-up of wrongdoing and whistleblower retaliations. Very importantly, weak ethics and poor external accountability checks do not automatically lead to the systematic abuse of power. For that to happen, leaders need to be willing to exploit inherent weaknesses. The actions of the TI leadership, particularly cover-up and the construction of impunity for wrongdoing, formed the third key dynamic of TI's 2015 to 2020 ethical breakdown. Some of these tactics were, I discussed 5 of them. Firstly, abolish transparency. TI systematically abolished public transparency on its own governance. It scrapped public board minutes in 2015, annual meeting minutes in 2016, its ethical advocacy report in 2017, its advocacy log in 2018, etc. The lack of transparency insulated the TI board from public scrutiny and provided cover for wrongdoing. Transparency International exists to create more transparency, not less. The second tactic, avoid accountability. In this regard, I will highlight 2 areas: using silence internally and denial externally. TI extensively used the power of silence to avoid accountability. For example, in total, I made 36 requests to TI for whistleblower protection from retaliation. The board and the board ethics committee not once acknowledged or clarified or rejected any of them as invalid. Over the years, my whistleblower complaints and requests just seemed to disappear into a dark hole of nothingness. As Beatrice Edwards writes in a foreword, from which I read, many whistleblowers are familiar with this treatment. When the institution adopts silence as a way in which to handle whistleblowers' disclosures or their protest about retaliation, there is no recourse other than attempting to reach a resolution through an external and equitably formidable institution such as the press. But then the whistleblower is accused of violating norms of confidentiality. End of quote. On external denial, TI's relationship with another organization called Accountable Now is interesting. Accountable Now assesses the accountability performance of many of the world's largest and most influential international civil society organizations, such as Amnesty International, Oxfam, TI, etc. These organizations are also the owners of Accountable Now. In 2019, I submitted a complaint to Accountable Now on TI's handling of complaints and accountability avoidance. Accountable Now accepted TI's extensive non-compliance since 2015. Moreover, despite TI's inherent denial in its 2021 submitted accountability report of any ethical problems or complaints since 2016, Accountable Now, who was fully aware that this was incorrect, publicly promotes TI today as, and I quote, being committed to holding its own leaders to account, end of quote. And that in the NGO sector, the TI board is, and I quote again, a best practice example of accountability, end of quote. The inherent flaws of accountability assessments owned by those being assessed become very apparent when those owners face a crisis. On this, I read from my concluding comments from the chapter on this. In 2010-11, Oxfam experienced a major scandal of sexual abuse in Haiti. The organization received multiple complaints with which it dealt either inappropriately or not at all. Oxfam covered up the scandal, provided wrongdoers with a, quote, phased and dignified exit, end of quote, and enabled them to work with vulnerable women and girls again. This was in 2011. During the same time, Oxfam ensured Accountable Now that it had, quote, a stringent policy on whistleblowing and complaints, end of quote. Only once the scandal broke publicly in 2018 did Oxfam report it to Accountable Now. Accountable Now did not seek to hold Oxfam to account for neither how they handled the scandal nor for its 7-year-long attempt to cover it up. Instead, Accountable Now focused on praising Oxfam's handling of the crisis 7 years later. The TI and Oxfam examples are stark reminders that detailed policies are only a starting point for ethical conduct, particularly during a crisis. The Oxfam and TI cases are also symptomatic of inherent structural weaknesses of the world's most prominent international civil society accountability process today. Overall, the Accountable Now process lacks a truly independent accountability assessment process that can initiate autonomous investigations and has the authority to enforce sanctions for non-compliance. The formal and external accountability mechanisms for ICSOs are in need of a rigorous rethink and significant reforms. The inherent weaknesses of the current system provided TI with a cloak of accountability over the last 5 years. End of reading. TI's accountability is not a private matter. TI exists to serve a social cause and is funded mostly from the public purse. TI's accountability for its actions is of public interest and it is critical to public trust in TI. TI's avoidance of accountability contravenes the public interest and undermines public trust in TI. The third tactic used by the TI leadership was to capture the integrity organs, in particular ethics and governance. For example, in 2018, the board put individuals accused of wrongdoing in charge of both the board and the staff ethics. They did so without first investigating the allegations. The result, dead-end ethical oversight. Or simply put, a complaint is received by and dealt with an accused. If I submitted my whistleblower complaint to TI in 2018, instead of to its donors, it would have been received by the chair of the ethics committee, who was one of the prime accused in my complaint. In 2020, another example on governance. In 2020, the board dissolved the senior management team following allegations in the Guardian newspaper. Once the dust settled, the most senior former member was appointed as vice chair of TI EU and to the second most senior position in TIS, Chief Administrative Officer, and in charge of TI's governance. A management member who was part of TI's anti-whistleblowing actions, retaliations, and cover-up in 2018 and 2019, now oversaw TI's governance reporting on that very period. TI's accountability report of February 2021, mentioned earlier in my discussion of Accountable Now, carefully constructed to avoid accountability, was a logical outcome of this. The fourth tactic, capture the integrity instruments of the organization, in particular to compromise reforms and manipulate investigations. In terms of reforms, TI announced integrity reforms on 30 August 2021, 5 months after the public announcement of this book. The new policies they announced integrate TI's own principles and external advocacy demands more clearly. They specify TI's commitments to the protection of whistleblowers, reporting internally and or publicly from all forms of retaliations and legal action. These are positive developments. Unfortunately, the critical systemic weaknesses of its ethics infrastructure were left essentially unchanged. Good policies, weak ethical structures. This combination has been at the heart of TI's integrity and whistleblowing problems over the past years. Reform led by those standing accused of wrongdoing and cover-up is an oxymoron. In terms of independent investigations, when concerns of ethical misconduct in the organization became public through an article in the Guardian newspaper in August 2019, to which I made no submission, other whistleblowers did that, TI immediately committed to an independent investigation after refusing to do it for 2.5 years. This was good news. TI's chance to come clear on past wrongdoings and escape being held hostage by them. Moreover, TI's public commitments were comprehensive. Sadly, its private actions were simply put devious. A few examples. TI publicly committed to a totally independent investigation. Yet TI privately instructed the investigators which cases could be investigated, as well as who could and indeed who should be allowed to submit evidence. In other words, cherry-picking witnesses. In my case, the board privately prohibited my evidence from being investigated, The investigator, the law firm Taylor Wessing in this case, wrote to me, and I quote, "Unfortunately, we regret that in accordance with our current instructions, we are not mandated to take your comments and contributions into account in the course of the current investigation. Please contact TI directly if you have any concerns in this regard." End of quote. TI ignored my inquiries. Moreover, the other investigation by the so-called independent ethics panel stated that interviews were conducted with all people that made submissions. At least in my case, that is not true. I sought clarification and I did respond. Quote, "From our side, there is nothing to clarify." End of quote. Another example. TI publicly committed that any and all alleged misconduct will be investigated and that misconduct will not be tolerated at any level of the organization. Yet it privately instructed the investigators which cases and people could not be investigated. In other words, cherry-picking cases. For example, the board excluded its own members from being investigated, despite several of them indeed facing allegations of wrongdoing and cover-up. Moreover, it gave the oversight and control of the investigations to the Board Ethics Committee, whose chair also faced uninvestigated allegations of wrongdoing and cover-up. One more example. TI publicly committed to an external independent investigation, and that the investigators shall be independent and seen to be independent of the TI movement. Yet it privately appointed the chair of TI Germany and one of TI's 10 founding members as the investigators of the so-called independent ethics panel. In other words, cherry-picking conflicted jurors. In the end, perhaps not surprisingly, in June 2020, the TI chair declared that no violations of TI rules were found. Moreover, that all concerns from 2017 to the present had been investigated and addressed fully. This is simply false. Moreover, in November 2020, TI passed a resolution stating that, and I quote, "No further investigations concerning all matters known so far in the period before March 2020 should be undertaken." End of quote. With this resolution, the Taylor Wessing 2019 and the Independent Panel 2020 investigation became the TI standard for fair and independent investigations. How can TI expect a different standard from others in the future? The fifth tactic, and the last one I'll discuss tonight, raid the moral capital of TI. In particular, the board used the power of hypocrisy to construct impunity for itself. When confronted with personal wrongdoing, the leadership simply countered that the whistleblower was the problem. Mentally ill and untruthful, whilst TI was leading by example around the world. In stark contradiction to its policies, principles, and public advocacy, TI privately asserted that the submission of a whistleblower complaint was unlawful conduct and sought to prosecute me for it. With its hypocrisy, the board raided the moral capital of the TI movement, acted untouchable and sadly also rubbished whistleblower protection. If agreements or NDAs could prevent whistleblower complaints, then there would be no whistleblowers. Whistleblowing is not an unlawful act. I read some passages from the foreword of the book by Beatrice Edwards. Former managing director Cobus de Swardt has written a compelling story of abuse of authority and unethical conduct at the apex of the very organization expected to safeguard accountability in governments and corporations around the world. As silencing a whistleblower reveals, Cobus de Swart's disclosures were and are a milestone in the accountability world because of the institutional hypocrisy he exposed. Periodically, throughout the narrative, we learn about the explicit commitment to protecting whistleblowers proclaimed by TI, not only before and after this chapter of internal misconduct, but also during the episode itself. Over the course of the same years, they spent pillaring Mr. de Swardt. Executives of the TI board endorsed repeated press releases and statements in favor of an EU directive that would oblige member governments to protect whistleblowers. It is perhaps this hypocrisy that makes the story so gulling. The do as I say, not as I do ethic of TI is simply hard to stomach. And this hypocrisy shows starkly that the responsible parties knew exactly what they were doing. End of quote. In the epilogue of the book, I reflected on the hypocrisy of TI. I read from the book. With each of the whistleblower complaints I submitted over the years, I wanted to believe that TI would act as they say. With every new violation, I was shocked anew. It took me years to learn that hypocrisy is a progressive and not a self-healing disease. That hypocrisy is not only a moral wrong, it is a very addictive and seductive form of power. End of the reading. I conclude. People often ask me what is the most important lesson from the book. For me, it is very simple. What happened during the story in TI illustrates the immense value of whistleblowing. Just imagine if the whistleblower allegations had not been squashed by TI, its donors and NGO peers. Significant damages to TI and many people could have been prevented years ago. Whistleblowing can be a force for the social good. If anything, these years have dramatically strengthened my belief in the positive power of whistleblowing, if truly independently protected. I have also experienced what happens if this is not the case. This whistleblower story began with the breakdown of ethics and transparency in the board of TI. In the end, it is a story of abuse of power, cover-up, and hypocrisy. From the world, TI demands transparency, yet acts with opacity. It commands integrity, yet acts with deceit. It insists on accountability, yet acts on impunity. Over the last 5 years, I have learned firsthand what happens in the absence of robust and truly independent ethics. Honesty becomes obsolete. Policies become window dressing, and power becomes ruthless. Since 2017, the TI leadership squashed 12 whistleblower complaints and ensured that none of the allegations implicating itself were ever investigated independently. This, very sadly, left me after 5 years with only 2 options: be silent and become part of the cover-up, or speak up and go public. I followed my civic duty and my conscience. The last sentence of the book. What a world would we live in if our fear of doing the right thing is greater than our desire for it. In more than 100 countries around the world, the TI movement fights tirelessly and bravely for truth and accountability. I now hope that this book will make a contribution and make this TI movement even stronger to the better protection of whistleblowers and to an increased appreciation of the immense value of robust and truly independent ethical systems. I thank you, the audience, and the organizers of the event for your time and interest. And Springer, friends, my wife and children, Frank Vogel and Pia Edwards. Without you, I would have been silenced. Thank you so very much. Looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Cobus de Swardt, for your really intimate account, I shall say. It's sort of, we've been, I don't know, given really deep insights in what you've experienced, and looking at the fact that there's great public and journalistic resonance to the book, and we're sort of in the midst of it all happening because it came out today, although you mentioned that TI knew before, I think in April, that it, or 5 months before, that it would come out. What reactions do you expect in the near future? What journalistic reactions or reactions from TI maybe do you expect from the publication of the book?
I could not say. I could speculate. I have over time, over these really 7 years when all of this was happening, and particularly the last 5, most often I was wrong to expect that people will stand up for the truth, but even more importantly, that people would stand up that when allegations are made, that they are independently investigated. So it is very hard for me to speculate what will happen. I know that TI in the past have reacted with virulence. Their press statement today is a very moderate one, in which they state that there was a conflict between me and the board, and that's why I left. I simply left because they fired me because I was a whistleblower on abuse of power in the board. So I don't know what is the next campaigns. I surely believe, when I said at the end, that I, in the end, had a civic duty not to be silent anymore. But what journalists and the world now does with this is really not in my hands anymore. I have tried internally, and I think it is now for others. What I truly hope would be the outcomes is that one would realize that most of the very good whistleblowing policies that we have around the world are actually worthless in a crisis if you do not have independent ethical oversight over them. When the TI whistleblower policies were formulated and adopted, I personally also thought they were quite good. I could never have, in my wildest dreams, 7 years ago, imagined that you could have such a capture of ethics in an organization. And I underestimated the importance of truly independent ethical oversight. And I hope that is the main outcome. But I also think that many journalists would not be that interested in a story. Ultimately, the book is quite a complex story that highlights from day to day how you can squash whistleblower allegations if you really have the intent to do so.
Do you think that public institutions being publicly funded and where maybe leaders or people in charge are not checked as much as maybe in private institutions where it's all about, okay, where do we go? How do we proceed? How do we make such a capitalist progress or make more profit, are more prone to corruption and issues of transparency or the lack of transparency and misinformation?
Johannes, I don't really think so. I think that ultimately, I think people remain at core quite similar. And if we know we're going to have to be accountable for our actions, irrespective where people work or even what their values are, they tend to actually not act unaccountable. And I think this is one of the lessons that, and the key drivers of TI over the years was to say, you need to ensure that the pressure to be accountable and transparent is built up, because that is one of the key ways to get people to behave with integrity, because they know what they do will become public. And I do not think that people often ask me about the kind of, the human weaknesses and so forth. I'm a sociologist by training, so I'm more interested in the social dynamics than the psychological. I do not think that there are really groups or institutions where people work where they are more or less willing to do the wrong thing. I think it is very much, and this is the core message from TI since its founding, that you need to keep the pressure on that people know they will not get away with it.
What are signs of hypocrisy? Because you mentioned that we have to sort of become very sensitive to those sort of small signs, and maybe sort of these dynamics in their development. How to recognize the maybe small, the ripples, the small first sights of it.
Yeah, well, when Jen was talking earlier on, when you see the small signs, and after 9/11 not addressing the issues, I thought about this very interesting study on the Bernie Madoff case, and where he so powerfully says to his assistant, you know how it happens. You take a few hundred and you get away with it. And then you take a few thousand and you get away with it. And then you take millions and you get away with it. And before you know, you just take as much as you want. This slippery slide of ethical conduct, I think, is one that is often underestimated. And that one thinks, well, I can just let that go. That's not such a bad ethical conduct. And I think that one should, whilst not becoming pedantically trying to have everybody live lives where they're expected to have an ethical check on a daily basis. I do think that organizations should be very sensitive to the fact that if particularly their leaders are seen to get away and start to blur these boundaries between what is acceptable conduct and what becomes unethical, that you actually intervene. One of the lessons I have learned is that, and I write about it in the book, that in retrospect, there were cases where I should have intervened going back 7, 8, 9 years ago in the organization, and where I didn't strong enough do it because you think, well, this is a misstep, this won't happen again, you speak to the person. And one of the ironic things is I write in the book that whilst I submitted my first whistleblower complaint in 2017, I should have actually done it in 2014 already, because it's then, and exactly what happened then was a pattern that later reestablished itself. So I think there one should be sensitive that there's a slippery slope that can happen with unethical conduct.
How can independent protection of whistleblowers or the establishment of ethical standards work? I mean, in a very pragmatic question, how can an institution maybe that has developed a certain size also install these sort of things? Because I'm skeptical when you say that there's a third institution that sort of can guarantee accountability of institutions that have themselves founded this institution as a third, such as a, I don't know, greenwashing sort of mechanism or sort of an ethical window. How can that work? Like, how can an institution reform, or what would you suggest?
Well, I think two things. Firstly, I think Accountable now does very good work, and a lot of it works very well. It's just when there's a crisis in an organization and the stress tests come, then those measures are not strong enough and the independence lacks. I'll give you a concrete example about independent ethics. One of the things that I realized during my own whistleblower years was that I had to report to an ombudsperson who was really caring, but was reporting to the chair of the board ethics committee. And there was the dead end. So I made suggestions, which TI didn't take up in 2017, that you get the TI ombudsperson not reporting to the board, but to the highest authority of the organization, its annual membership meeting, and then automatically to the public. And I linked that to something that when I was at TI, I advised governments to say, when you want an investigation, don't get it to report to the cabinet, get it to report to the parliament and direct to the public. In that way, you immediately know that these reports will both be public, and there is no control by those that have a vested interest to cover up anything. So it is not so difficult to create a greater level of independence oversight if you truly are willing to risk it that your organization will have to face the consequences that an ombudsperson will report publicly without your board being able to in any way influence those reports. And this is no dissimilar. I've done many years a report for Oxfam when they had a crisis, and I insisted that my report, as it is, will be made public. It will also go to the board for their decisions on what to do about it, but it will be made public. And I think that there are ways that you can do it, and it is critical for whistleblowers to know that they don't have to walk the tightrope similar to what I have to do today to actually have to go public. It defeats the whole purpose of whistleblowing if you in the end leave them no choice but to actually have to go public and risk new waves of retaliation.
Yeah. Can you describe again or go back to that tipping point where you decided to change your mind about how to go about these things and how to go, going public instead of changing TI from the inside?
So as I mentioned, first whistleblower complaint submitted in 2017, 2018, many more, 2018. Then in 2019, when they announced an independent investigation, I believe now it's going to be resolved. So I made that submission. I detail in the book how that was squashed in detail. I made the second submission to the so-called independence panel. And then I waited for them to interview me, to contact me. And on the 2nd of June last year, when the reports were made public and TI declared this is the end of the story, everything has been investigated. At that point, I knew I had no choice. And it is not an easy choice because I knew that what I exposed myself to is even worse than what I've had to face before. Through the fact that I've been a whistleblower and TI's retaliations against me, I've become unemployable. Nobody wants to touch me with a pole. Doing these actions are unlikely to really change that in any way. On the contrary, it is likely to make retaliations worse. I list in the book the people that all had an influence that could have prevented this. The organizations, the donors that helped to squash the whistleblower complaint by just ignoring requests for whistleblower protection. So in that sense, I think that when I made that decision, it was driven by the final sentence that I read. What the world will we live in if we start to fear doing the right thing more than our desire for it? I was born not as an activist, but I surely, in my time as an anti-apartheid activist, started to deeply believe that the common humanity and the struggle for social justice needs one to stand up in moments when it is uncomfortable to do so. And I'm a huge optimist. I truly believe that our struggle for human rights, despite what the last 5-6 years have brought upon the world, and Jen has described much of that, that our fight for human rights actually can go dramatically forward in the next couple of years, because I believe that there are many, many people across the world that truly want to have a greater common humanity. The crisis of the climate has both a very frightening side, but it also has a huge push for us to see the common humanity in us. And I think that that belief that I have, that our quest for a human rights and the common values that can bind us together for a greater justice, we should live them. And that makes it easy in the end.
Yeah. We have one last question. Maybe I have a little addendum to that question. Is there any organization around that you find trustworthy enough to become a whistleblower and say, okay, that's
I write in the book that the night before I submitted the whistleblower complaint, I thought I was the luckiest person in the world, because I was submitting it to the organization that is a world champion on whistleblower protection, and indeed advises the G8, the G20, the EU directive, heavily influenced by TI. So I got that very wrong. So if you ask me at this moment, no, but what I would most definitely say is that whilst the policies the organization have, I would look at carefully, I would particularly look at what are the recourse of total independent oversight that is available, because I think those are, in my experience now, even more important than the policies. Policies can become window dressing very easy if there is a leadership willingness to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Cobus de Swardt, for having your book premiere tonight with us. Thanks again, Jen Schwartz, who is still in the meeting in the background and has followed us throughout. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to my colleagues in the background managing the whole technical stuff, the direction of the stream, and helping me out with the chat questions. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the Q&A sections and who have reached out with their questions and remarks. Stay true to us and to pause sometimes for your I question your own ethical standards by which you repost or like a post. Maybe read your posts before you share them, and pause a little before you go about online and share information, and be very careful about information, because this is sort of what wraps it up for me, being very careful about what we have in front of our nose. Might be deceiving, but there's still hope with the new book. I hope it finds a lot of interested readers and has a wide spread. And I wish also to Jen Schwartz that her stories get an abundant audience in the future, as they have already. Thank you very much. Keep following us and have a good night and a good day, depending wherever you sit and watch the stream. Thank you very much.